Hey guys, it's Matt Staggs. I'm the host of Mazes and Mythos. For the last few days, I've been going back and forth with this podcast. I look back at the episodes I have in the can. I've interviewed quite a few people, and I'm excited about them. I think they're great. But I don't see much of a uniting theme beyond just being stuff I'm interested in. And generally the things that I'm interested in are mythology, folklore, fable, culture, and how story and narrative and what we believe plays a big part in how we live our lives, and how those things are all related, how we get our beliefs from the stories we've been told, and how the stories we tell about ourselves affect other people in their lives. So it might just be over the next several weeks, months, God willing, that this podcast has to kind of smooth itself out. But, story is kind of like that. It changes a little bit over time. Extraneous details are added, smoothed out sometimes, rubbed away. And over time, I think what the most essential element of that piece is becomes clear, and it becomes stronger, and it's passed from person to person. So you might see things on this show or hear things that don't necessarily conform to what you expect, but it's okay. Stick with me a little while. I think you're going to like what happens. Well, I'm driving to jiu-jitsu right now, so I probably better turn this microphone off. For those of you that were wondering what that roaring sword sound in the background is, well, if you guessed a car, you're right. Anyway, my guest is Lionel Snell. He is the author of several books under the pen name Ramsey Dukes, one of which is a favorite of mine. It's called Uncle Ramsey's Little Book of Demons, the advantages of personifying your problems, or personifying life's problems. And I think it has a lot to do with Gestalt psychology, the idea that you're sort of talking to different aspects of your life that are giving you trouble. It's more to do with that, I think, than sorcery or anything weird or spiritual or magical. So if you're just interested in interesting ways to solve your problems or to think about life's little difficulties, do stick around. I think you'll like what you hear. Bye-bye. Hey, okay. Lionel.
Hi.
Thanks so much for coming here. I really appreciate having an opportunity to speak with you. I've read some of your stuff and have just found it interesting on quite a few different levels, particularly the Little Book of Demons.
Ah, yes.
I should mention that you're not only Lionel Snell, you are also who?
Ramsey Dukes.
Ramsey Dukes, where did you come up with that name?
It was a sort of happy sound I made at one time. I began by sort of doing it anonymously. Sesopemy was basically anonymous, and I quoted someone called Lemuel Johnston. I mean, basically, ideas came to me, and I was quite curious of their source. I didn't think, is this me or is it not? And so I tended to adopt different names, and Ramsey Dukes was just a happy sound I made one day. And then later I thought, it's Ramesses II, Ramses II, E-E-U-X. So I decided that's who I'm channeling.
Well, that's actually something that's a good point. In magical traditions, there's the idea of taking a name, like what Crowley was a Frater Perdurabo, is that it?
Yes,
my pronunciation is terrible. Believe it or not, there's not many people that know this in Mississippi, so I read it but don't hear the names very often. But is there also the idea that when you take a name or choose a different identity, you are enabling yourself to think different ways?
I think so, yes. Because one of the things that I've just been writing about, actually, is that I used to be fascinated by, the old books on magic. They'd be by Paracelsus or Agrippa or something like that. And then scholars used to say rather snootily, of course, that's pseudo-Paracelsus. It wasn't actually written by him. It's someone taking his name because it sounds grand. Now, what occurs to me is that if, say, I was influenced very much by Aleister Crowley, but if I really study his work and, and his writings and his letters, things like that, and then I write a book, is it less honest to say it was written by Aleister Crowley when so much of him has gone into it than to say Lionel Snell wrote it? I always felt a bit distant from the name that goes at the bottom of it. As far as I'm concerned, these are ideas which are in the air, and I happen to tune into them. So I never felt quite that sense of ownership that some people have. They got to have their copyright on it.
Well, I assume you want to get paid, though, right? I mean,
well, yeah, it's nice, but actually, sort of level that my books go out. I'm so thrilled if anyone reads them. I wasn't that bothered. It's only as I approach old age and pensioning that I realize I do actually need to have a source of income, because this is this is where it'll come from when I can no longer write.
When you talk about choosing names and currents being in the air, I think about the internet. This is a grand era for that kind of thing. I am one of very few people who use their real name everywhere. And I almost do that because it's first, I have such a bizarre name, and it's easy to get everything I need. The internet's probably not a good place for the John Smiths of the world if you're looking for domain names and Twitter handles.
Yeah.
But also, I think that there's sort of what somebody would call marketing or brain recognition, or someone else might call almost a talismanic power to having your own name out there and being repeated. But
yes.
I also wonder if by taking pseudonyms online, are people giving vent to various passions or interests that their main identity would not tolerate?
Ah, right. Yes, like people who do flaming things like that. Yeah, funny enough, I'm very bad with names, and it's the sort of the last straw for me. That like in Facebook, so and so wants to be your friend. And of course, as a writer, it's very likely it's someone I don't know, and very often they have funny nicknames, which
right.
I think, who is this guy? And so I try to look at their profile as much as they will allow me to sort of work out who it is. But I find that that's very difficult for me. It's bad enough just people sticking their own names. When they add magical names and then they add internet names, I get completely lost.
I have the same problem, being a writer, podcaster, and doing a few other things. And it can be a little worrisome. And what I've done is take the Freemason approach. I don't know if you've ever seen the bumper stickers that say, "To be one, ask one."
Oh, right.
Yeah, I make sure I have it set so only friends of friends can request my friendship.
Ah, yes.
So,
yeah.
It's a good way to screen. But
yes, it's difficult as a writer. You feel you don't, if someone likes your stuff enough to say, "Can I be your friend?" I can't bear to turn them down.
Do you feel like maybe they have an idea of you, just like you have an idea of, say, Crowley that's in their head? They have their own little Ramsey Dukes.
Yes, I think the inner Ramsey Dukes, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because it brings me around to the topic of demons. I was going through a pretty rough time, and I picked up your Uncle Ramsey's little book of demons. And the title caught my attention, but when I really got into it, I learned that this was very similar, some of the ideas you were talking about, to psychological concepts like Gestalt psychology. You're essentially personifying your problems, aren't you?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, how that worked, what a demon is, and why you chose this framework to discuss some of the ideas you have?
Yes. Well, it was the urge to write a sort of more practical book for another publisher. And one of the aspects of magical thinking, which I think is very fundamental, is that projecting of consciousness into something. And I give the example of, the little baby who is, on the one hand, throwing a spoon off the table and watching it fall every time. And then on the other hand, there's mother who pretty regularly comes and picks it up and puts it back. But then a difference begins to emerge because the mother doesn't always do it the same, not as reliable as the spoon. And so there's this, to me, a huge jump in consciousness when you think, I wonder if there's something like me inside mother making her behave in this more erratic way. Now, I see that as very fundamental part of magical thinking. The weather, you either sort of treat it as just a set of phenomena and you look for repeating patterns, things, or else you can say the weather seems to have a mood to it. It's glowering today, it's happy tomorrow, and you sort of, as it were, project a spirit into the weather, and that approach, you go to the garden, you want to plant something, and you think, I'm going to ask the plant what it wants. Now, you don't expect to hear a voice coming back saying, plant me over there.
Unless it's certain kinds of mushrooms.
Yes, yeah. You think, how is this plant going to communicate with me? You sort of open up your senses till you get an impression. And you get an impression, I think it wants to go over there, and you walk in that way and it begins to feel better. So that to me is very fundamental part of magical thinking, that putting consciousness out into the world. And it's interesting to me that one of the sort of things, that religious culture damns magic for is trading your soul with the demon. And in a sense, that's what you're doing. You're saying, I'm going to give a bit of soul to this thing, put myself in its shoes, and see if that helps me deal with it. It's a sort of trading of soul, give a bit of soul and see if it responds. And so I thought that was interesting. It sort of fitted another aspect, the religious accusation, one's trading one's soul. And I think religious people say it is not your soul to trade, it belongs to God, But as I say, as a way of working, it's valid.
Well, when you say you're giving something a soul, do you mean that you're projecting some part of your psychology or inner person as a tool to kind of intuitively think about what's best about this thing or what it wants? Or do you mean literally it's becoming animated or alive in some way?
That happens, I think, yes. It begins with a gift. Now the people. This idea of a gift is very fundamental to me, because when people say, the trouble is when you talk about magic, people say, yeah, but do you really believe in it? And you realize, do you really believe in fairies? Do you really believe in demons? The trouble is they are using the word belief in a different way. Now, the way I see it is in religious culture and scientific culture, belief is something which is earned. If I say to a group of people, do you believe in fairies? I expect the answer most likely to be no, because what they mean is that fairies haven't earned their belief, either because they're not in the Bible or because they don't fit the scientific worldview, and they've never seen them. They've never had them demonstrated, so they haven't earned belief. Now, if I say, do you believe in equal rights for women? Most people would say yes. But you could put the same argument. You could say, well, I've been all around the world and I've never actually seen a place where I think women get totally equal rights. So why is it you say you believe in that and you don't believe in fairies? And the difference to me is that in the second case, you're sort of saying, I'm giving a gift of belief to equal rights for women. I'm committing myself to it, or I'm accepting it as an idea. And to me, that is the way magical culture believes. When the person picks up the tarot cards and says, these contain the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, he's saying, I'm going to give a gift of belief to that idea. Just as when you go to the theatre and the man on the stage says, I'm the king of Prince of Denmark, you don't put your hand up and say, rubbish, stop this, it's a swindle, he's just an actor. You give a gift of belief to that and you have an amazing experience if it's done well. And similarly with the tarot pack, you give a gift of belief that it's a powerful set of symbols coming back from time immemorial. And that is the initial effort, the giving that gift, just as with the demon saying, I've had this pattern of bad luck. I'm going to speak to it as if it's got a purpose, if it's trying to tell me something. And then what happens if you do that right, and if it's appropriate, it sort of comes to life. It becomes to be more vivid, and then you can create a dialogue with it. So in both cases, it's giving that gift is the initial thing. And then what happens after is where the magic builds up.
If you'll hold just a moment, my dog is tearing something up in the other room. I have a puppy, and I'll be
I saw it
back.
on your website. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Backseat of the car.
I hate to get so deep into these conversations, but my wife is going to kill me if I don't do something about this. Hold on just a second. Hey, buddy. Okay. Here you go. There you go. It's gone. All right, I'm back, and I'm so
Didn't
sorry.
hear any
I've been
barking.
No, that's I'm very fortunate. He had a pillow in his mouth, my wife's pillow. So,
All right.
right, barely escaped disaster there. But yeah, let's get back to what we were saying. Is this then a pact between the imagination or the intuition and the rational self?
I think pact is a good word, actually, because, again, it goes back to the traditional thing of you made a pact with a demon. Now, you see, that makes religious hackles rise. My God, you shouldn't be speaking to these things. The only thing you should do is to banish them. But I think, to me, there's a strong analogy with the political one, which is, if you label someone a terrorist because they're trying to do things that you really disapprove of, do you say, I'm never going to speak to that person, only thing I'll do is get rid of them? Or do you say, I think I would like to find out what they want, what their purpose, what they think their purpose is? Now, to the purist, that means you've given in to them. But the skill is to actually listen to what they say without being seduced by it or, fooled by it. It's a bit like the Middle Eastern saying, trust in God, but tether your camel.
Or like God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, sort of go and speak to these people, but keep your hand on your wallet.
My father-in-law always said, he's retired now, but always said that if you see someone with a sign that they're a quote-unquote Christian business, that they make a big deal out of it, you should keep your hand on your wallet at all times.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
With these kinds of things, when we talk about demons, I found that it was a great metaphor for dealing with my own worries and bad habits. It was suddenly like I'm a martial arts practitioner.
Yes.
I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it's been kind of a alchemical process for me in the sense that it's transformed me psychologically, spiritually, physically. But I oftentimes have a voice saying, well, you don't really need to go to class. Or, well, that was quite scary, wasn't it? Why don't you stay home today and recover? And that sort of thing. And I named that demon, or at least I recognized it, and spoke to it quite a bit. And I speak to it about exercise. It allows me to engage in a dialogue with the worst parts of myself. And it's I saw in that when I was reading your book, like I said, a parallel between some of the ideas of Gestalt theory or Gestalt psychology, that you kind of invoke something or a person that you're dealing with, and have a
Yeah.
dialogue with it. Like if you had an abusive parent, a therapist might say, why don't you imagine that person in the chair over there and talk it out.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I didn't know if there was any crossover between these ideas,
Yes.
that you were
Yeah.
familiar with one. And,
I haven't particularly studied that. I'm just sort of aware of it as an idea, and I realize it's very much parallels. What I tried to emphasize in the book is that people very quickly try to get back to a simple formula. I think it's perhaps scientific culture expects us to find a recipe, a formula, an algorithm for dealing with things, so that, okay, I realize I can personify this problem. Okay, so I'm going to give it a name, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do this, that, and the other. But very quickly, they're trying to make it back into a mechanism. Now, one of the things I put in the book was, okay, you're having problem with with a certain aspect of thing, and you recognize it as a demon, and so you think you're going to now cure the problem, and it doesn't work. Why? And I sort of say, before you read on, think why it hasn't worked. And I said, the reason is because the demon is also reading this book. You see, that gives the example, say a couple have really got to loggerheads, they reach the sort of deadlock that some couples do. And suddenly the man or the woman is changing their manner. They're speaking differently. And you think, oh, this is great. She or he is so obviously making more of an effort. Then you find on their bookshelf a book called How to Deal with Difficult People. And you think, bloody hell, she's trying out this formula on me. And then it all breaks down again. And I sort of say, basically the same thing happens with demons. If you think that, okay, I've got a method now, I can deal with this thing, you're not really giving it, doing justice to it. You might get so far, but you really have to say, what does it want? What is it trying to do? And it may be something very simply, it may be as stupid as a creature, but it's doing justice to it is to really allow for it having an intelligence, being responsive, being reflexive. You found out about it, that'll actually affect its behavior. And the way to do that is to really sort of put yourself in its shoes and see if that tells you more. And so similarly, someone, going back to the example of the terrorist, okay, we'll ask them what they want. We'll knock up a few solutions, and that should keep them quiet. You say, does it really? Or do you just raise their suspicions that you're pulling a fast one on them? Sort of really try to get under the skin without actually succumbing or going over to them.
So what do you do if I can't look at this as something that I can fix, and the demon, following the metaphor, is already aware of what I'm trying to do? What is my option if I know I have a demon? Which, as an aside, is if you talk to people about demons and pacts with them, or being aware of them, it's one thing. But then you mention personal demons, and that's a metaphor everyone's aware of.
Yeah. Yes.
So what do I do if I have this awareness of the demon?
Well, one thing is, it may have a purpose. Now, I don't know if I put in the book, but one thing I remember was being in a sort of circle of New Age people, where you sit around and you begin by saying what you want to get out of the circle, sort of thing. And one after another, being New Agers, they say, in my life, I want to get rid of fear. It's holding me back. Sort of one after the other, they all said that. When it came to me, I thought about it, and I said, I don't want to get rid of fear, because if it wasn't for fear, I wouldn't be alive. I would have thrown myself out of trees as a kid. I would have done this, that, and the other. So I really value fear and the protection it has tried to give me. The only thing is, it's like a policeman. Policeman's great, but you don't want a police state. So I'm really grateful to fear and the lessons it's taught me and the things it has said to me, but I don't want to be ruled by it. So I want to form a relationship with fear where I can listen to it, thank it for its advice, and then make my own decision as, without getting all worked up about it. And so I think that with some of these demons, it's a similar thing. I can't really speak for you, but the sort of thing of I don't want to go and do my exercise. I don't want to go into the class today. Is it saying there's something else better that you could do, or is it saying really you're getting pretty tired, Matt? You ought to take a break sometime. And if you haven't been listening to it, is it being a bit too persuasive? Is it trying too hard because it's feeling ignored? That's the sort of question one might pursue in a case like that.
So sometimes these demons, these personal demons, have a useful or constructive side to them.
Yes, or they may have begun from something constructive like fear, which is a very important part of human makeup, and either through being despised or ignored. I mean, fear gets a bad press in our society, doesn't it? Oh, you're a coward, this, that, and the other. And so what is actually an important and useful function gets despised and then gets a bit desperate, or tries too hard and tries to take you over. I think... I use the word demons because it was a sort of convenient overall term. Sometimes I wish I'd called it the Book of Angels. It might have sold much better.
Well, I wondered, that's something I wondered about, because the title really drew me in, and, I have a great interest and love for the unusual and the dark, and I might not have picked that up otherwise. And I wondered...
Yes.
At the time, if you had written with that model specifically to kind of draw in, occulty type people and give them a way to improve themselves that wasn't necessarily something that they would reject out of turn. That you, demons, cool, and then, wait a minute.
Yeah.
But also, that's kind of, you're a guy with a sense of humor too. Some of the titles of your books certainly reflect that. Can you name a few of them?
Well, blast your way to megabucks with my secret sex power formula. And I always thought the subtitle was important. And other reflections upon the spiritual path. And SSOTBME, it stands for Sex Secrets of the Black Magicians Exposed. And the idea was, I sort of later, in a later chapter, I say, why is it that magic books get given dramatic titles like Sex Secrets of the Black Magicians Exposed, which of course is the very title I'd used, but I put it in as just the initials. Let me think. Blast your way to megabucks. What I did in my holidays, essays on black magic, Satanism, devil worship, and other niceties. Yeah.
Well,
I always had fun with the titles.
I always think, what's funny is that deadpan sort of droll sense of humor. I don't know why I associate it with kind of an English sensibility. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, it's this sort of understated absurdity that, of formalism. I'm reminded of the joke in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where Arthur Dent is having to go into line, and he says, "I'm British. I know how to queue."
Right.
I don't know. It's hard to put my finger on that, but folks from
just the other day we watched again one of my favorite comedy movies. I mean, so often comedy movies don't work for me because they're over the top. But Galaxy Quest,
Oh, it's a
you
funny
know that?
movie.
I thought it was amazing. I just, split my sides with it. And trying to analyze why I found it so funny with Lynn, my wife, I said, it's just my sense of humor when something absolutely absurd is treated absolutely seriously. And it's the same with Men in Black, this crazy sort of over the top urban myth of Men in Black. But in the film, it's, oh no, that's absolutely how it is. They pick up the National Enquirer and say, this is where the real news is. Things like that. I just thought that was hilarious. And so when I used to write a column for a small magazine called The Satanist Diary, and it was a similar thing. It began with, this sort of Dennis Wheatley type of Satanism, the really over-the-top ultimate evil Satanists. And I did the same thing, Of course, there's a satanic conspiracy behind everything that happens in the world. Anyone who's a decent Satanist knows that. And then I sort of, like Fungus the bogeyman, I entered into this upside-down world where one is constantly trying to do evil, and unfortunately, occasionally, good things happen. So yeah.
It's almost like there's an understanding of a respect, and at the same time, a respect of orders and formality, but also a understanding of its essential absurdity. And, it's as an attempt to control chaos that can't be truly controlled. Are you familiar with? I can't think of his name. The author, the book series is The Laundry Files. It's by Charles Stross.
Oh yes. Yeah, my son sent me a couple of those. Yeah.
Right. The guy is just some regular low-level computer programmer that finds something out that he shouldn't have and gets drafted into this occult agency. Well, they're battling Lovecraftian horrors, but they're doing it. They have a terrible bureaucracy. It's you have to file paperwork for every little thing that you have to do, and they'll go and defeat something like the Dunwich Horror, and then come back and have to fill out requisition forms and inventory and it's funny, and especially for someone like myself that has worked in a large bureaucracy before.
Yeah.
So what you're saying kind of reminds me of that. And
yes,
now
that's a good example. Yeah, that's it, because it takes this whole thing on board and puts it in such a sort of dull context of bureaucracy that it actually makes it funnier. It's again, like some of the John Cleese humor.
Yes, I love
was like
him.
that, where something totally absurd is then you have a ministry of funny walks. You take something which would be sort of vaguely amusing in its own right, you put it into that very formal context, and it becomes utterly crazy.
Right, and there's so much to make fun of out there, and it's almost like a trickster archetype that's going and sort of infiltrating this human idea of control, and we kind of get back to the same thing about trust God but tether your camel. This is probably going to work out, but
it's very subversive, isn't it? It subverts reality, which
right.
I like.
And I'm sure you've probably read the Illuminatus trilogy.
Yes, way back when it came out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember there's the character and I can't remember the name, but he called himself the Midget because he was a little person, and he started hanging flyers up that he had made or notes, announcements that he had made, and signed them all. They were absurd proclamations, and he signed them all. I think MGMT or something MGT. Which in his mind stood for the midget, but others interpreted it as management. Yeah, so it was, or it's also another great example of that is Catch-22. When the protagonist, it starts with him in a hospital bed, and he's taking letters home from different people, and at first he's going through and blacking out the things that are sensitive, but then he starts blacking out things at random and blacking out certain letters and turning them into, works of pure chaos. And I don't know if you've read that. It's a great book.
Yes. I remember the man who was all bandages with a thermometer sticking out of his mouth.
Yeah, yeah. These are that was a wonderful book, but it's still that same sort of idea that there's only so much control you can handle.
Yeah.
And a little chaos is necessary.
Yes. Yeah.
Do we have to have our demons then?
Do we have to have demons?
Would we feel okay if we didn't? Could we progress?
I tend to see myself as a sort of like a democracy. I know that on the one hand, one can think one's got a sort of a unified person, ego, this is me. But actually, I got a lot of voices inside me. I mean, when I was at school, of course, as a teenager, it's a great thing to stay up all night. Wow, you've really grown up when you stay up all night and that sort of thing. Now, I was horribly aware that the 6 o'clock in the morning me is different from the going to bed me. And the two met if you stayed up all night. I was still the late night me, and suddenly the sun was rising. I was beginning to think about breakfast. And that was quite creepy. I realized that, I changed through the day. And so there are a lot of me's. When you go home and suddenly you're with your family, sometimes it's quite embarrassing how people change. You've known them at the office and they've been sort of, or at school or whatever. And then you go home and see them in their family and they become rather childlike. So there are a lot of voices inside me. So I would like them all to have their say. I'd like to be a democracy inside me, that I'd like to try to take all their opinions into account. And so in a way, these are all my demons, and some of them are more angelic than others. But they're all there. And I don't quite know whether there's one ruler. Maybe the ego is the sort of the boss. Yeah, I don't know about that. I'm just aware of this sort of sense of many different parts of us, and all working together, ideally, and fighting against each other, not ideally.
There's a Freudian aspect to that. He had a few good ideas, of course. He has a bad reputation now, but the idea of the ego and the id and the superego, it's different aspects of the same person. I think his ideas were. Go ahead.
Quite a hierarchical view, sort of working together as a hierarchy. I've also got. I think there is that hierarchy. There is a sort of the ego and the superego, but I also think there's a lot of things on the same level. Sort of the id may be made up of a whole crowd of voices. It could be like the masses within.
Would you say that this is in any way similar to the Jungian concept of the archetypes, that we all have these sorts of elemental elements from the collective unconscious?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, and whether it's like there's this one archetype, but again, I think it's like a grouping of elements, groups around an archetype. So, for instance, take a very obvious archetype like Mother or the goddess. There are many different aspects of femininity and womanhood which group under those headings. So it may be, experiences of your childhood. It may be a beautiful woman you saw on the street or whatever. And all those sort of images cluster around an archetype, I would say. And so there is this central archetype which goes back through time immemorial. But in the individual, it might actually be a sort of hive mind of little impressions and things that have happened over the years, which have gathered into that form.
Have you thought about the way that maybe sometimes you can collectively not collectively, I'm sorry, consciously try to invoke one of these archetypes or ideas to guide the way you work or the way you think. It's there is a role-playing game, and I don't know how familiar you are with tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and
Not
Dragons.
much.
Well, you do understand the concept, though. It's a
Yeah, I
storytelling
get the
game.
concept, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, and I've been playing these things since I was a child. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for 33 years now. One of the ideas that I got from it is the dungeon master or narrator as a psychopomp in a way. You're leading these characters deep into the underground while they play these, and battling monsters. I mean, I don't know how more metaphorical that you can get than that is to go deeply into a dark labyrinth, battle monsters, and claim treasure. But
absolutely, yeah.
and these characters are, archetypes: the holy man, the magician, the trickster, the thief, and the warrior. These are amazing. But I sometimes wonder if we can consciously try to embody these archetypes, say the warrior, the magician, and another game, and I'm sorry I'm going a little geeky on you here, is it really played with that quite consciously. It was called Unknown Armies, and it was a game of the occult underworld, underground. And the characters could achieve a state of semi-godhood or gnosis by consciously choosing to quote-unquote walk an archetype. Became it at some point. You became the embodiment of whatever that thing was slowly.
Yeah.
By invoking it a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
Is that something that is familiar to you, or can one invoke one of these ideas?
You just said the key word to me, which is invoke. Now, in the sort of traditional invocations, which like Crowley quotes, the process is a sort of a threefold one, where you begin by describing the thing you want to invoke. Jupiter, sort of. He is the one who rides on the storms. He is the great one whose generosity is boundless. You describe it like that. The next stage is you speak to it. O thou who does this, that, and the other. O thou who is the source of all bounty. O thou, sort of thing. And then the third stage is you speak as it. I am he who, I am he who does this. And it's interesting that I've seen that turn up in some psychological processes, and they call it the 3-2-1 because it begins with the third person. So, for instance, if you have a problem with a certain type of person, and for me it's the sort of bullying corporate person like, what's his name, Rupert Murdoch or someone, who exercises power. What you do is you write a description. Take a sheet of paper, write a description. I hate the sort of person who does this, who uses his money and his power unscrupulously to do this. And so you fill a whole page describing this person until you feel you've captured it. Then you take a second sheet of paper and you write a letter to that person. Look, I can't stand the way you do this, and I hate this, and that sort of thing. Until you feel you've really got that out of your system. Then you take a third sheet of paper and write it in the first person, as though it was that person writing. I can't stand wimpy, tree-hugging, bunny-hugging creeps who are afraid of making a profit or whatever. Now, the interesting thing, if you go through that process, is that it develops, it begins to solve the crisis in your consciousness because you begin to see through the other person's eyes. And again, it's this thing of, of speaking to the demon without giving in, because you begin to form a relationship. And it doesn't mean you just now can accept that type of person, you actually form a relationship where you begin to get somewhere, a dialogue builds up. And so that's the sort of psychological process I've seen demonstrated in sort of psychological workshops. But it is exactly the same as the grand invocation that, Crowley, speaking of the bornless one or whatever, that's the formula of it. You begin by describing in the third person. You then move on to addressing it in the second person. And finally, you identify with it in the first person, 3, 2, 1. And so that, is a formula which has appeared both in traditional magic and in recent psychological ideas.
Do you see any similarity between the alchemical and of course a concept of turning the great work, turning lead into gold, and the way that it was kind of co-opted by the Western magical tradition? Do you see any similarity between that idea and the concept of self-actualization, that perhaps meeting one's holy guardian angel, or getting to know one's true self, is kind of the same thing, that you're taking all these disparate elements and getting to know yourself better and bringing them together as a more whole person?
Yes. It's interesting about the disparate elements. One of the processes I think I described in Thundersqueak is a sort of peeling away of labels. Now, when I talk about the many parts inside me, a lot of those are labels that society has put on us, and some people absolutely identify with those labels. I don't know, it might be I'm a Republican, and I believe this and I can't stand those. Now, the process as I described it is, right, I'm an Englishman. Is that utterly important to me? What would happen if I happened to have been born in France? Would I not be me? And then you realize that actually, no, there's a lot of me would still be the same. I might be speaking a different language. Then you say, I'm an educated person who went to Cambridge. If I hadn't gone to Cambridge, but had gone to Oxford or, not had an education, would I be totally not me? No, there's a lot of me left. And that sort of peeling away, you realize a lot of the labels that describe you, identify you, although they're quite important, if you take them off, there's still an awful lot left. So I do have this idea that you can take off all sorts of labels that society puts on you, and still there's a basic humanity which is left, which is yourself. And perhaps in the Jungian sense, it might be the capital S self. And the interesting thing is that by the time you've taken off all those labels, it's actually, you get down to something, a core humanity, which you share with a lot of other people. And I find that interesting because it's like you've taken the path of individualism. People will say, oh, you're navel gazing, you're not socializing, you're just looking within. And you end up by finding the very thing you've got in common with all of humanity. Now, I'm not equating that with the alchemical thing, but I think it's one of the elements that we've got all these separate parts, but at the core of it, there's something which is utterly me, and yet it is also utterly human. I think that's sort of over the horizon. It's an ongoing process, but I think we're approaching towards that when we do this self-actualization.
Yeah, there were some people, and I may get this wrong, I think Maslow, Abraham Maslow, who most people know for the hierarchy of needs, believed that one never gets done self-actualizing. that you're always in a process of becoming you. But the you does change. You in some ways, but maybe that's because you're getting to know who you really are. Because I am in some ways very much the same person I was as a child. Yet it seems that I've changed, but maybe it's more that I'm just getting to be more me as time goes by. How do you tell? How do you tell what's going on?
Yes, the child is an interesting example, you see, because I can think back to times when I was, the idiot teenager in love and be so embarrassed. God, I want to disown myself. Now, actually, that's an incompleteness because I really need to, again, form a relationship with that part to the point where I can forgive it, take it on board, say, well, that was part of me. It didn't know any better. And then my present self becomes like the mentor to that child inside me, can help it to grow up. Because if you cut it off and say, oh my God, I was a total idiot. Thank God I left that behind. That part of you can remain as a sort of incomplete child, which is left crying in the past. So the thing is not to shove it in the basement and lock it up, but to speak to it and help it to get more mature and become part of the whole of you. Does that make sense?
It does, because I had a really rough childhood and was very angry and depressed a lot and thought life was pretty much over like a lot of teenagers do. And at the time, and this is really strange, it's kind of recursive, I always used to think about my future self telling me that the life ahead would be better. And now that I am that future self, I imagine myself, and sometimes I do, talk to my young self that
That's
it's okay.
Very good.
Well, it's odd. I mean, it's such a recursive idea, but perhaps that is a good way for me dealing with that part of me that was wallowing in despair, and also the things that caused that negativity.
I think that's great. That's great because you've actually done the two things. Because it's one thing to go back to the past and as the wise healer, as it were, with your present, in my case, nearly 70 years old, experience of life. I can go back to that child, but actually to be able to realize you can do it into the future as well. I get into a real panic about my, I'm trying to fill in my tax forms, things like that. And to be able to say, there's an older person who I'll become for whom all this will be stuff of the past. I can get advice from that future person. I can get help, support, as well as me being able to support my own past. That is really good because then you're working both directions.
I sometimes think about worries and problems when they get out of control, and usually I'll remember at a certain point that 2 weeks from now, a month from now, sometimes even a day from now, this will just be something annoying that I went through. And most of the problems I've had have been that way. It's kind of a similar concept.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was quite suicidal at times in my life, and I was very much aware of a learning process of getting out of that. Even at the age of 7, I wanted to kill myself. I was so miserable at times, not all the time, but it happened. Then by sort of 12, 13, I sort of realized I want to kill myself, but it really would hurt my parents, and they didn't mean to put me in this situation, so it's not fair on them, sort of thing. I'd get into that type of thinking, the effect on other people, and then a later stage for me was right. Okay, I want to commit suicide. But I've gone through this before. You know, do I wish I'd committed suicide when I was 7? No, because I've actually had some good times since. Well, how do I know I'm not going to have good times again? A recognition that this is a thing you go into and you come out of. In other words, it's a pattern that repeats. And then you begin to think, well, it might be an idea to commit suicide, but wouldn't it be stupid to make such an important decision when I'm at the low point? So if I really think it's a good idea, I ought to say, next time I'm feeling really good, I'm going to commit suicide, because I'll be doing it when I'm at a high point, when I'm at my best. Now that gets really paradoxical, and that for me was the sort of way I grew out of. Isn't quite the right thing, because I do think one can validly commit suicide, but the way I resolved it in myself, and it was a sort of a growing up with the idea, and yeah, that's it, and talking to the idea, if you like. Okay, I think you're right, life is miserable, I want to die, but I'm not going to do it when I'm in this state. I'm going to do it when I'm in a good state, and I know I'm doing the right thing. Then you don't.
Do you think that there's? Let's get back to the concept of a recognition of absurdity and form. And do you think humor is a way for us to reconcile, perhaps, the essential possible, meaninglessness of life, and to deal with the anxiety, to joke about it, maybe in a way, like they say, whistling past the graveyard.
Oh yeah, yes, it's a strange thing. I must say, humor continues to puzzle me. I know when I was writing this Satanist diary, it was particularly in the late 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. Now, by nature, I'm a sort of a liberal in the old-fashioned sense. I think basically, given a chance, humans are okay. Now, it was a very bad time for liberals in the 80s, what with Thatcher and Reagan and all that. And then the battles that broke out in Czechoslovakia. Because I sort of had the idea, as long as people get on with each other and are neighbours, they speak to each other, you won't have problems. But there it was, people who'd been neighbours and friends suddenly turning against each other. It was a horrible thing. So I used to write this diary, and I really was expressing anger as humour, and it was very healing for me. I can't think of examples. Margaret Thatcher came in on the motto "Labour isn't working," because it was very low, employment was down and all that. She came in and then put a lot more people out of work. So in this column, I spoke glowingly about her courageous stand against the Protestant work ethic. In other words, damning her by praising her. It was a way of sort of expressing anger, and it was very healing for me. To write as a Satanist in praise of the most awful things in a way that they would have hated to hear themselves being praised. It was a way that I dealt with it, but it's very hard to explain or to to give a formula for that, for how it might work for other people.
Well, people have been doing that for a long while. And here in the States, there's a group that calls themselves, I think they call themselves the Temple of Satan. And they are doing exactly that. The whole thing, I think, is just a big absurd art project, or excuse my language, but mindfuck. They're using the idea of Satan to parody and annoy politicians that they dislike. That this person has the endorsement of the satanic group. They also
Ah, yes, exactly what I was doing, actually. That's interesting. Yeah.
they also like to go places that are voting to have prayer in school or put religious monuments on public property, and they'll go and I think they've had a giant hideous sculpture of Satan surrounded by children built for Wisconsin. After the people there said, we can have religious monuments if they're neutral to religion. So they go, okay, great. Yeah. I know you're doing this as a backdoor for fundamentalist Christianity. So here, we're going to use the worst thing you can possibly think of and insist that it goes on.
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh. Oh, yes, a sort of, a Baphomet surrounded by holding out his hand to little children and giving them sweets or something.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And again, it's just one of the other things that they did that I thought was hilarious is they went to, I'm sure you're familiar with the Phelps family.
No, I'm not actually.
Maybe you're lucky enough not to be, but the group of people that show up to protest everyday events and tragedies of any sort, and with signs that say God did this because He hates homosexuals.
Oh, yes. That's
okay.
Yes.
Right. They say it a lot worse ways, but they went to a graveyard and where one of the Phelps's grandparents or something were buried, and did what they called a pink mass over it. And declared that this particular person or persons were dead, were suddenly gay in the afterlife.
Oh yeah, yes.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. Humor is a powerful weapon.
Yeah. And actually, just going back to your original question, of course, extreme version of it is, how people cope with a war situation, a battle situation, and recently I saw the movie Wiper's Times, which was one example, a true thing in the First World War, how one of the ways of dealing with the sheer horror of it is humor. I remember someone saying that when French people went over the top in the trenches, they sang patriotic songs. When the Germans went over, they sung hymns. When the British went over, they shouted marmalade. That was one of the ways you do something as stupid as that. It's one of the ways of coping with this, what is absolute nightmare. Yeah.
One of the things I did when I was working at this horrific bureaucracy, I hated it, was to start joking quite a bit in ways that would subtly disturb or confuse the orderly minds of the people around me. When I had to fill out progress reports about my monthly activities and allot hours to each task that I had used, I would start putting in things like, trip to New Orleans to buy gopher dust. 7 hours allotted to hunting leopard on campus. Sometimes I would write ghost stories in the reports. And it was not only something fun for me to do, it also was practical in the sense that it showed me nobody actually read these things.
Oh, I was going to say, was it noticed?
Not for about a year. And after that, I just started copy-pasting every old report that I had and giving it back to them, and they never noticed. I did that. I did things like, hang signs on places. I put up, in case of zombies, don't use elevator. Just little things everywhere to trip up.
Oh, that's lovely, yes.
Yeah. So I think about that as humor as a coping mechanism. So you were trained as a mathematician, is that right?
Yeah, yes.
How did a mathematician get to this?
Oh, no, that's easy. You see, this is example I've written recently, that if I tell, quote, rationalists, unquote, or people in the sort of current scientific culture, a good way to do gardening, vegetable gardening, is to speak to the fairies and ask them, where you should put the plants and get advice. In other words, what Findhorn did, where they spoke to the Devas. The response tends to be, but there's no such thing as fairies. They don't exist. You can't do that. They don't exist. Show me them. Where do they live? They don't exist. Now, when I was studying maths, our maths teacher came in one day and wrote on the board, let I be such that I squared equals -1. And for the whole of the rest of the first lesson, we were all saying, but you can't have a square root of a minus number. It doesn't exist. He said, well, think of it as another dimension. Okay, another dimension. Which direction is it? Where is it? Tell me this dimension. All the sort of things that people would say if you said fairies might exist in another dimension. So basically, we refuse to cooperate because the square root of 1 minus 1 doesn't exist. But the mathematics thing is, well, who cares whether it exists or not? The thing is, does it work? So you start working as if it exists, and I emphasize as if because that's the magical formula. You act as if something is true. You act as if the tarot pack really was the wisdom of the ancients. And the mathematician finds that not only does it work, you can create a mathematics on what they call imaginary numbers, but the amazing thing is it turns out to be utterly fundamental to the way the universe works. Electricity and all that sort of thing depends on these imaginary, quote, numbers. And you realize that has gone on throughout the... Oh, I just have to answer this.
No worries.
Yeah, I'm still on the phone, then. This has gone on throughout history because actually numbers don't exist any more than fairies, and yet our whole economy is built on them. So as a mathematician, I wasn't hung up on whether things exist or not. The question for me is, do they work? Do they get you somewhere? And our mathematics master, because we did maths and higher maths, we also had to do physics those days. And when we went off to do the science school, he'd say, oh, you're off to the folklore department now, because he was very scornful about these scientists with their insistence that they would only work with things which existed. He said that gets in the way of sheer logic. And so I see it as really quite fundamental to my magical thinking. The fact that I learnt that what matters is whether something works, not whether it exists or not.
I was intrigued by your ideas of, when you have I think the example that you used was when you have a problem with a photocopier, to talk about it, to talk to it about what the problem is.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really intuitive approach to trying to, kind of brainstorm about it, but also to deal with your own frustration.
Yeah.
You get to know the photocopier as a slightly intransigent friend.
Yeah.
Has that helped you before to deal with different problems? To go, now, why this object? Why are you doing this?
Yes. You see, I really like that example to start with, because if you launch straight into... when I'm in my writing, I always try to go from everyday life. A lot of magical writing drops you right in it. There is this mysterious other world of demons, this, that. I try to get something very ordinary, and I say people do speak to their cars and things when they're going wrong. Oh, come on, you silly thing, and all that. This is absolutely natural human behavior. Now, if a man with a white coat and a clipboard comes up and says, excuse me, do you really think it can understand when you think? People say, no, of course, this is stupid, it's childish. Well, why do you do it then? And I say, it isn't that stupid. Firstly, because it's absolutely natural thing for a human to do. And okay, why might we be doing that? And then that really launches the whole book. The whole thing that putting your consciousness into things is actually a very sophisticated way of handling problems. It uses much more of your brain than just treating it as a mechanical process. So that was why I particularly like that example, because it's something that people do without thinking, and they're a little bit ashamed if you question them about it. And I say, no, don't be ashamed. This is actually a very interesting way of working with the world. Let's explore it.
Can I ask you a question? You had talked about getting close to 70, and how this kind of figures into how we deal with our problems and fears. Did old age or growing older terrify you when you were younger? And if so,
yeah, no, not at all. It was way ahead. Now
Right.
it's beginning to get a bit scary. My father died. He was younger and fitter than me, and within 6 hours from having a stroke, he was dead. And I realized, wow, I'm on borrowed time. When I find myself actually aches and pains and arthritis, everyone says, "Oh, you look so fit" and everything, but I'm thinking, blimey, I've got to try and finish my next book before I snuff it. It's more formidable now than it ever has been.
How do you deal with the fear?
Talk to it. I think my biggest fear, and you can relate this to sort of Saturn in the sixth house, is to suddenly become inoperative. If I had my full consciousness, but I couldn't move my limbs, that is scary to me. And so sometimes when I'm lying on my bed, I think, how much of this can I take? Do I just have to turn over in order to prove that I can do it? How long could I stay? And I came across that recently when I had a very long dental appointment, 5 hours in the dentist chair. And they said it's going to be 5 hours. And about a quarter of an hour into it, I waved my hands and said, I've got to sit up. And I needed to sit up once or twice just to prove I could do it. And that they would let me do it. Because I began to be really frightened that I was going to have to be 5 hours on my back without daring to move, So there is a problem there that I still have not come to terms with. And it's work I need to do. And it relates to, as I say, having a stroke or ending up in a hospital bed as an old man.
This is something I fear quite a bit myself. I'm going to be 42 in January, and it seems like just yesterday I was 21.
Oh, yeah.
And I often think about how quickly decades fly by. That I will be 70 tomorrow. You know what I mean? That if just yesterday I was 22. And
it gets faster, I can tell you.
right. And I have the hardest time dealing with that. I worry about it quite a bit. One thing that someone told me, a guy I know named Daniele Bellelli, who is a philosophy teacher and a martial artist as well, is that he said that in itself was egotistical. You don't know if you have any more years left or any more days. And I've tried very much to be right now. And it's such a hard thing to do, to be in the present.
Yeah. Yes. For me, there's the feeling that there's more to be done, books I want to write, things like that. And the fear that as busy as I am now, I may not ever be able to complete them. That's unpleasant. I certainly don't think I've got a right to a future, some sort of divine right. I don't believe that. But there is the speeding up of time, which is disturbing, and it's part of the reason, I find this whole sort of Facebook thing, so many people out there, some of them could become fantastic friends, but I get all these sort of messages that someone invites you to do this or invites you to do that, and I just have to turn my back on them because, I just cannot cope with all that, plus the things I'm trying to do. And then time flies. I suddenly realize, like when you put a message to me, I didn't notice it until weeks later.
And then months flew by before.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. You know, uh,
Well, this is a
it,
good point to leave off with. I want to thank you so much for being here, and I would love to talk to you again. This has been one of my most anticipated interviews personally.
well, it's been a joy to me because there are so few people around me that I can have a conversation like this. And again, I could go on forever. So, yeah.
Well, where can people find you online? You keep mentioning Facebook, but I don't want
Yeah.
strangers to suddenly
Mm.
start hitting you
Yeah.
up for friendships. You may run out of room on your account.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've never I should have done it 10 years ago. You know, get the website up and all that sort of thing. Um, Arcanorium College is one place where I have operated, and I've not done it for a few years, but I'm going to restart one of my courses. The first course I did, which I called Alchaos, about it's an alchemical process of transforming the lead of the present moment, the boringness of the present moment into gold. And we're going to start in, I think it's in about a week's time or so. It's launching that particular one. Um, it's based on the idea of I'm interested in the way that nostalgia can make even bad times in the past have a golden glow. You know, like people who remember the wartime and sort of say, oh, you know, there was more spirit then or whatever. And you think, blimey, you know, they're seeing gold in the past. And I'm saying, is that looking at the world through rose tinted glasses? Well, rose tinted glasses actually don't put a color that wasn't there, they take away all the other colors. So maybe nostalgia is able to get to the essence of the past without all the clutter, everyday clutter when you're in it. And can we do that in the present moment? That's the course. And it's one that, as I say, we're going to rerun on Arcanorium. So that's arcanoriumcollege.com. It's Peter Carroll's online. Arcanorium, Arcanorium College, all one word.
Okay, guys, that was it. Our first episode, first one in the can. That was Lionel Snell, aka Ramsey Dukes. And if you want to come by our website, my website actually, it is at www.mazesandmythos.com. Hopefully, within the next couple of days, we'll have some added bonus content for you to listen to. I asked Ramsey a couple of questions off air, and we've got his answers there. So come on by and check it out. Thanks for listening.